Hey everybody, it's Chris, the host of Is It Just Speculation, the podcast where we take a look at the gray areas of life, where things are not always black and white or as they seem to be. We cover a lot of different topics with a lot of different people, and so if you like this episode, feel free to check out the other ones, and make sure you follow the podcast for the latest upcoming episodes as well. Glad to have you here. Stick around for more. So everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I'm really excited for our guest today, which is pretty much the final of what ended up being a series with Dr. Rabin up to Aaliyah Ewing, where we kind of touched on sex trafficking a little bit, but we didn't really dive, head in. So with Esther today, definitely we're going to take some, hard looks at a really tough subject and have some questions, and I'm sure some other things will come up while we're talking, but I appreciate you guys tuning in, and, just take notes. If you have any feedback, send it my way. If you have any follow-up questions, send it to me. Maybe I can pass it on to Esther and get you some feedback on that. So, just give you a little bit of background. Esther Toribio is a registered mental health counselor intern at the state of Florida. She's a world-traveled advocate, and you'll hear more about that. She's a legal executive assistant and paralegal to 15 years plus, who is the founding face, owner, and podcaster at Striving Minds Network, LLC, a mental health counseling private practice in Miami, Florida. So without further ado, here is the conversation from start to finish. Hi, Esther. Can you hear me?
This is awesome. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I'm glad that we could connect. I know technical issues are kind of, sporadic.
Yeah, it's crazy. I used to have a podcast. It's on pause now.
Mm-hmm.
And I was struggling so much because I had to use Podbean. I was using Zoom to record, to then drag and drop, but it seems like Anchor's the easiest way.
Yeah, so far, I'm actually lucky to be sponsored by them, so
Wow,
you won't hear any bad from me.
that's awesome. Well, it's nice to meet you.
You as well. I don't know if you are aware, but I've been working on, I guess it might be considered a series. I talked to Jessica Rabin. I know you've talked to her in the past. And we kind of briefly mentioned sex trafficking and human trafficking, but very little. After that, I talked to Aaliyah Ewing, who is a young public speaker. She had a public speaking engagement not too long ago. But we mainly focus on domestic violence. So we don't go too far into the sex trafficking. So you have like a unique perspective, especially with your job and what you've done overseas. Before we really get started, can you tell people about yourself and kind of what you do?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Esther Victoria Toribio. I am a registered mental health counselor intern in the state of Florida, and I have been in my own private practice for nearly 3 years, helping young adults ages 20 through 36 in the areas of survivors of sex trafficking, childhood sex abuse, religious abuse, purity culture, domestic violence, and just pretty much anything wrapped around abuse and trauma.
Yeah, and you've been on this path for a while. I know you had been, from what I understand, you had been working in the legal side of things for a while, kind of supporting your schooling to be able to do this. Did you carry over any of the legal stuff that you learned into your new job?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm also still in the legal field. In the private practice, I work part-time, and then in the legal field, I am an executive assistant and a paralegal. I have been in the legal field for over 15 years. And I have learned quite a few things. I always refer to the Florida statutes just to make sure I do everything legally and ethically. And opening up my own private practice, I kind of learned it from the attorneys on the documentation that I needed in order to get my private practice up and running. So I guess that helped.
Yeah, that's a real unique, background to have, especially with helping people that face such a challenging subject. To be able to fall back on not just your, counseling side of things, but also the legal side of things, especially in your area. Because I
Absolutely.
know, I mean, that's one thing that people don't really want to start, like the process, because they don't know what that's going to lead into.
Mhm.
Some people may start the process with you as far as like therapy, and then maybe throw out a random question about the legal side of things, and then you have the expertise to kind of fall back on. So I think that's a really awesome skill set to have that I don't think a lot of people in your field do.
No, they
Um,
don't. So I guess you would just say that I'm Jane of all trades.
yes. And with sex trafficking, it is such a heavy topic. And
Mhm,
from my experience, people that have gone into that kind of, specific thing that they want to help with,
mhm.
usually have like a background that led them to that, like something that set them on that path. Is that the case for you as well?
It is. So I was already in college and getting into grad school. I knew I had always wanted to learn about psychology, learn about trauma and the brain. But it really wasn't until I joined, I guess, a college conference in Atlanta with over 30,000 college students. And the theme, or they were rather trying to raise awareness for global issues around the world. And one of them was highlighting sex trafficking. And I'm like, okay, what is that? You know, here in the United States, it's more glamorized. It's prostitution, it's escort services. You have your high end strip joints. There's, prostitution happening, in the champagne
Yeah.
room or whatever you'd like to call it. But um, they were just highlighting sex trafficking, in Europe and in India, and how it's more of an Eastern culture kind of thing, and how people in poverty um, were selling their children to Johns, or the modern day pimps,
Mhm.
to not only sell their children for money, but these children or teenagers were being trafficked. And when I mean by trafficked, it's these kids are abused sexually, they're abused physically, emotionally, mentally. So it's like abuse all in one package, and they're being sold not only into slavery, but they have to perform certain um, sexual acts for men or women within their countries or within their communities. But also, you have um, men and women from the United States traveling to Europe and India to have sex with these children and with these teenagers or even
Mhm.
young women. So it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's pretty gross if you'd ask me for my opinion, but um, so this was being highlighted in the conference, and I'm like, okay, well, I know I want to get into psychology. I know I want to work with trauma, and so I just started doing, my research. And it led me to 2012, where I had the opportunity to see, I guess, sex trafficking front and center in northern India around Kolkata.
Okay.
And that's where it really started. That I was like, okay, this isn't just something that they talk about, in the United States. This is something that, yes, it is happening worldwide.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And aside from being at that place, as you said, you're a Jane of all trades. You travel quite a few different places.
Yes.
Can you tell everybody kind of maybe the different countries you've been to and kind of what you did in those different countries? Because it is quite an extensive list from my point of
Yes,
view.
it is. So in my early 20s, I was heavily involved in local churches in Miami where they would do mission trips or global charity events. And my first trip, I hopped on a plane. I didn't know anybody on the team. Our teammates were from different parts of the United States, and I jumped on a plane, and I'm like, you know what? A massive earthquake had just hit in 2010, and we were doing disaster relief there, doing tent city visits for all the residents in Port-au-Prince. And we were delivering food, we were delivering messages of hope, clothing, anything really that the residents needed for that whole week. Definitely eye shocking, to say the least, because it was my first international trip outside of the United States. We visited orphanages. It was just great, a overall great experience. Not per se the circumstances, but
Yeah.
it really allowed me to open my eyes that not everything is green. In the United States, everything is not green on the other side of the world. I then went to Cuba. We did, I guess, personal development for the youth and teenagers over there. Um, I've been to El Salvador. We did sex trafficking ministry there for the teens, homeless youth. Um, I also went to Dominican Republic. We went to very poor communities there in the sugar cane factory. We did children's and homeless children and homeless youth. We focused a lot on that. In 2012, like I said, I hopped on a plane with four women on our team, and we did sex trafficking ministry, abortion awareness ministry as well. We provided basic skills training for survivors of sex trafficking. We had a safe house there. That trip was pretty interesting because we were in the pub of a sex trafficking community, and
Yeah.
sex trafficking there, there are children and teenagers that get sold into slavery. However, there are young teens and young women that decide to be trafficked. So they're openly um, approving of being sex workers in their sex trafficking villages. And we had to negotiate with one of the madams to release one of her young adult workers. We had to negotiate and say, hey, listen, she cannot provide the money or the work for you. She is cognitively and physically ill. And we were able to rescue her from that village, and we brought her over to the safe house, and she was there for a couple of years until she passed. She was diagnosed, I believe, with HIV and AIDS. She was severely beaten, but her story is very unique because she was sold into slavery at the age of 6 by her parents, and in her, I guess, sex work career, she had given birth to a son. She must have been 20, and her son is separated from her because of her work. And before her passing, I would say maybe a couple weeks prior to her passing, she remembers the village of where she was sold and left. So she traveled many. She was already rescued at this point at the safe house, but she had told the house mother or her house parents, "Hey, listen, something is just urging me to go back to the village, the very village that sold me." She finds her way to this village. She reunites with her son, reunites with her parents, and almost reconciles with them, and comes to terms
Yeah.
of like, I know you sold me, but I know you sold me as a means for survival. And she reconciles, with that village. Ironically, the village was called Jericho, so there's some like biblical connotation to that, but
Yeah.
um she reconciles, and then a day or two later they find her like she passed away, but she's holding her Bible. But that story is just a story of hope, a story of reconciliation, a story of survival, a story of forgiveness. So that trip is one for me for the books that even
Yeah.
um, living a life of, like I said, survival, sex work, living a life of trauma and abuse. Um, there is a point in their lives or our lives where we come to terms and say, you know what, I could either take my trauma um, and leave it there, or I could take my trauma and become restored and renewed and find healing even through the trauma.
Yeah, that's such a great story to know that even with as bad as it was, there was still that, silver lining in there towards the end.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that we've discussed on the podcast previously is like post-traumatic growth, like something really good coming from something, so horrible. Um, Now you did mention something that I think a lot of people may not really be aware of. Whenever you're talking about getting her out of that, that brothel,
Mhm.
you said a madame. Now,
Mhm.
that's saying that a woman is the one running this place. Is that right?
Yes. So it's the female version of a pimp.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
no, I think a lot of people usually just assume that it's going to be a guy pimp, because that's usually what we're shown, in like American media. But from your experience, is that not always the case? Is it like more often just an equal split?
Yeah, and more you hear it more often here in the United States that there is a John, and a John is another word for a male pimp. But in some of these places, whether it's international waters or American water or American soil, you'll have your pimp or your John, followed by, I guess, an accomplice. And that
Yeah.
accomplice is usually a woman, which is a madame, um, or someone, a woman who is pretty much soliciting or trying to grab other women working under her.
Yeah, I think that's a real important point because I think a lot of people just automatically look for, a guy being the one that's, being a pimp. But, if you're out there in the real world looking for these things, looking for signs,
Hmm.
maybe focus on women as well, especially if they fit kind of, maybe what you would expect the signs to be for somebody.
Hmm.
And you did mention something else, and it's not exactly the same age group, but I've heard in the past you talk about infant trafficking. I did not know that was a thing. Can you tell people a little bit about that and how that works?
Sure. So infant trafficking is it's beyond me what people will do for money. Infant trafficking, I actually saw this firsthand in Haiti. Uh, the orphanage that we had been helping, it seems like once we left, 6 months later, the orphanage was under investigation because the person running the orphanage was trafficking the infants,
Wow.
but also trafficking the body organs of the infants. So, infant trafficking is very gruesome. It is a real thing, and that you have individuals, not only, again, in international waters, but you have this in the United States. People are selling infants or their organs and trafficking them. And okay, well, what is someone going to do with an organ? Well, there are people, in other religious circles that use these organs for, spiritual sacrifices, or
Yeah.
I mean, I won't get into detail, but it's just very gruesome. But infant trafficking starts as young as 6 months. Um,
Yeah,
it, yeah.
that's really crazy. I don't think anybody, from as far as I know, nobody I know has even mentioned that or heard of it. And
Mhm,
I was really shocked to, just on paper, infant
mhm,
trafficking. That sounds horrible.
yeah.
Excuse me, but the reality of that, and what that probably leads to, which is another term that you've used in the past that I had never heard before. Like I said, I feel like you have so many parts to your background and so
Mhm,
much to draw on that these things that maybe a lot of people really don't. So,
mhm,
something that probably leads to is trauma bonding. Um,
mhm.
what exactly is trauma bonding? Because that's something, like I said, I've never heard of.
Okay, so trauma bonding. Trauma bonding is pretty much um, emotional ties or emotional bonds that arise from recurring abuse. So, for instance, you'll have a child who is being sexually abused, for
Mhm.
example, by a relative, and a child where the brain is still developing is unaware, able to distinguish the difference of, like,
Yeah.
okay, is this right? Is this wrong? My father's touching me inappropriately, but I like it. So it causes almost a sense of confusion between the child, because the child is like, okay, this is my father. He's touching me inappropriately. I know it's wrong, but it feels good. So
Yeah, and
that's
I'm
a
sorry to interrupt, but
go ahead.
that's one of the reasons I pointed out the infant trafficking, because they don't, like, literally have no other idea what is normal, because they literally grow up in that world. That's why I thought it was so important to talk about the
Mhm.
trauma bonding, because I mean, how do you, if you're in that situation, how do you actually realize that you're in that situation if that's the only world you've ever known?
Right. And the only way that the person or the individual is able to distinguish the difference is, sadly, when they grow up, whether the abuse stopped or the abuse continued, they seek professional help.
Yeah.
It's through therapy, it's through EMDR, it's through psychology or through a psychologist that the individual is able to process and able to distinguish, okay, it felt good because as individuals we have sexual organs, and kids as young as 2 or 3 start exploring their bodies and touching themselves, and it feels good. So when you have an adult touching a child inappropriately, the child's gonna be conflicted, but internally be like, wow, that feels good, but my dad shouldn't be touching me.
Yeah.
So with the trauma bonds, it's defined as the misuse of fear, excitement, sexual feelings, and sexual physiology to entangle another person. Now, oftentimes, adults that sexually abuse children, they themselves were sexually abused or exposed to sexual abuse as a child, and as an adult, they never processed that trauma.
Yeah,
Off-
and I think a big part of it is they don't realize that it is a trauma.
No.
Because if they don't ever have maybe a talk about it,
Right.
and nobody ever points it out as being wrong, then they just assume that's how it is. And I think that
Right.
kind of perpetuates itself.
Right. And I like I mentioned earlier, I do work with young adults that were sexually abused as children, and as adults, they're coming to terms of saying, okay, well, I'm having difficulty in my intimate partner relationship. I'm having difficulty engaging in sexual activities with my partner. I'm having difficulty thinking about, or the anxiety of like worrying that I'm going to touch my child inappropriately. So I work
Yeah.
with adults that have those reoccurring thoughts that they fear that they're going to touch their children inappropriately. But I always reassure them that they're at the right place processing their childhood trauma
Mhm.
to prevent them from acting on that thought.
So basically, just the idea of being aware that you have those thoughts
Mm-hmm.
is enough to kind of push you in that direction to be able to, fight them off or to
Yes.
treat those thoughts.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. One of the things that is pretty common among, sex trafficking work is the church involvement with mission trips, which I think is something that you're pretty familiar with, of course,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but also organizations. And I'm not sure if that orphanage that you mentioned was one of those type of organizations, but, how much of a factor do those kind of places play into the fight against sex trafficking? But on, the other hand of that, we also hear about faith and religious abuse. So how do those two things kind of balance each other?
Well, that's definitely that's a big chunk of a question. Um, sadly, you see in your more um, overly religious, overly evangelical, um, Southern Baptist institutions where abuse is so prevalent, sexual abuse is so prevalent, and you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be SBC, but you hear, a pastor resigning because he sexually abused someone from his ministry or was having an affair. And a lot is highlighted on the pastor or the leader of, giving them grace, but a lot is not highlighted on the actual victim
Yeah.
or the individual that was being abused. Um, it's honestly, it's not only very touchy, but sadly there are institutions that they don't practice what they preach. So if you're in an unhealthy institution, it's not going to bear the fruit or bear goodness, um, if they're trying to end, for example, sex trafficking in the Middle East. So it starts, and this is something I was thinking about this morning. The global pandemic of sex trafficking
Mhm.
will not end if we first don't address it within ourselves. If we first don't um, process through our own generational trauma, ancestral trauma, our own childhood traumas. Like, we first have to come to terms individually. Okay, as an adult, admitting that there was even admitting that you might have been a victim of sexual abuse or sexual trauma as a child.
Yeah.
It's not when we first admit that or when we process our own stuff, uh, that something as large as sex trafficking will end or that there will be progress. I don't know if
Yeah.
I'm answering the
No,
question correctly, but
no, it makes sense because I think a lot of it is most of the time, from what I've seen, the sex trafficking issue or trafficking in general always is treated after the fact. Like there's not any real prevention to go to the everyday person and say, what are you working on and how can we,
Mhm.
fix your issues first? Like we're basically putting the Band-Aid on rather than preventing the cut.
Right,
Uh,
exactly.
how I would see it.
And
Yeah.
we're also not having those, we're not having meaningful conversations.
Mhm.
So, uh, we could tell each other that we're having a great day, but we're not really engaging in dialogue.
Yeah.
People are afraid to talk about religion. They're afraid to talk about politics. They're afraid to talk about certain topics because it may come out as offensive. They're afraid to talk about mental health, you know. But
Yeah.
it's all these stigmas that need to dissipate almost. If we don't talk about the real issues or explore these issues, then like you said, it's going to be a band-aid. It's not really going to cure the core issues.
Yeah.
Another thing is that we're not having healthy sexual communications, or sexual education with the younger generations. So I was raised in a very predominantly religious household, and sex was not talked about, or sexual anatomy was not talked about. So as an individual, I had many questions, and I didn't really have an outlet or a set of older individuals to go
Yeah.
to get my questions answered. It really starts at home, to be honest.
Yeah. And I feel like whenever we were kids, it's already different from, the younger kids now. Like my kids are, really young. So they have a whole different world from what me and you had.
Hmm.
But I feel like when we were young, we didn't really have anywhere to go and seek out those questions
Hmm.
that we had. But now, every kid knows about Google. You can just
Yes.
ask Alexa whatever question you want.
Yes.
So I feel like we're in a different world already to where if we don't tackle those issues whenever it's appropriate, of course,
Hmm.
they may go and seek out those other alternatives. And, of course, aside from just the internet, they also have media. And, like I mentioned before, that's always shown a certain way, but it's not always the most accurate way. So I
Hmm.
feel like there's definitely some room for improvement there.
Yeah.
One of the other things that you had mentioned before um, is a different term that I had never heard about either, which, like I said, you have so many things in your background. I love it. So,
Thank
um,
you.
what is religious sexual shame?
Mm. Wow, that's a big one too. So religious sexual shame is pretty much the idea or the notion that whatever decision you make or whatever act you do is shamed because someone above you has told you that you can't do that because the
Mhm.
Bible says so.
So, just to throw this out as a example that a lot of people might immediately recognize is if you're married, you can't get divorced because divorce is wrong.
Mhm.
Like that's to
Yeah.
me, that's the common one. Is there any other ones that are kind of one of those?
Yes.
Hey everyone, it's Chris, the host of Is It Just Speculation? What if I told you that you can make your very own podcast for free and you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership required? That's Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast, and that's what I use. It has all the tools that you need in one place so you can record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. So you can work on the go or you can work at home in the comfort of your PJs. That's what I do sometimes. Don't tell nobody though. Anchor also distributes your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more places all around the world within a matter of moments. That's the beauty of Anchor. It really lets you have a message and get it out there. You have your own voice, guys. It's everything that you need to make a podcast in one convenient place. Please download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm and get started. You're missing out if you don't.
One of the most recent words is purity culture.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you are familiar with the purity culture movement, but the purity culture movement happened in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it was just pretty much just a wave of letting teenagers up having teenagers abstain from sex to wait to have sex until their marriage night, and promised all of these things that really empty promises almost. So
Yeah.
you can't text someone of the opposite sex after a certain time. You can't, you have to time how long you're going to hug someone of the opposite sex. You can't be alone with someone of the opposite sex. If you engage in sexual activities with someone of the opposite sex or someone of the same sex, because that's another thing in religious communities, it's like, no, you can't be gay, you can't be lesbian, you can't be bisexual. Like, you can't because if not, this is going to happen. Or if you have sex before marriage, you might get pregnant, you may get STDs, you're going to be looked upon as like a filthy rag or a
Yeah.
piece of chewed gum, like all of these things. And it really almost, if not almost, or it did cause a lot of religious shame and guilt, and a lot of religious mental trauma, so to
Yeah.
speak, to those of that generation or those coming out of that generation. I was one of them for sure. I started going to church, and I started going to a church, and that was it. Like, if you wanted to, hug, your brother in the Lord, it had to be a side hug. You couldn't text. Like, they had almost all of these rules and regulations and restrictions that
Yeah.
didn't really allow young adults or teenagers just to be young adults and teenagers.
Yeah, it sounds like what you might call avoidance. Like you're
Yeah.
not really actually talking about the issue. You're just trying to pretend like it doesn't exist, whatever the issue is.
Yeah.
Um,
And the purity culture movement um, resulted in a lot of shame, religious sexual shame. So you have these young adults or adults, they're almost confused. They're like,
yeah,
well, I love God, but I have sexual urges, or
yeah,
I love God, but I'm afraid I'm gonna go to hell because I like women, or having same sex attractions. So I treat a lot of my clients are coming out of purity culture, the purity
mhm.
culture movement, or they have gone through religious abuse or religious shame, and I help them process through that.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Like I said, I feel like it all kind of ties together those
Mhm.
different things, and they all kind of build on each other. And I feel like just acknowledging those things, and you can be on both sides of it. Like I said, you work with the missionaries that
Yeah.
work with the churches, but you can also see the other side of it.
Mhm.
Like it's not a black and white issue for
Right.
lack of a better term, but for sure that's something that is common.
Mhm.
One of the things that goes with that, not only in the churches, because like you said, there's been people that have had affairs become public, and so all of a sudden they have to quit their job.
Mhm.
But there's also celebrities in general. The recent one, Bill Cosby, R. Kelly,
Mhm.
I think Prince Andrew, if I want to say, is the one from overseas that got in trouble.
Mhm.
Um, Jeffrey Epstein. Like, there's a long list of these
Yeah.
celebrity types or people in power or privilege that also kind of go under the radar because they're able to do things without being arrested or even seen because they're on a private jet, that kind of thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
Earlier we were talking about people flying over to India to buy sex, basically.
Right.
Obviously a poor person is not going to make a flight across
Right.
the seas to do that. So
Mhm.
a lot of it is the people in power, the people that have the resources. How do we deal with those kind of things that almost seem like they're above our level because of the resources that they have?
I think it's calling it out. right? So if people like Epstein or even people, in religious power,
Mhm.
sexually abusing their own children, we have to call it out and expose that darkness. And like I said, it starts within our homes. It starts when we engage in conversation. It's also educating ourselves. So we could definitely watch a documentary on Epstein and our blood can be boiling, but what are you going to do about it? Are you going to finish the documentary and that's it?
Right.
Okay, wow, that happened. Or are you going to educate yourself? Are you going to find local resources or local organizations that are combating the fight against trafficking or the fight against domestic violence and abuse? So it's really almost holding the individual accountable. I remember seeing the Epstein documentary and my blood was boiling, and I was happy that those survivors came out and shared their story. That's
Yeah.
hard, you know? But the more I learned about the Epstein documentary or just that lifestyle, reminds me that sex trafficking is going on here. So it's
Yeah,
not
that's a
an Eastern thing, it's a Western thing. And like I mentioned earlier, it's glamorized. You have sugardaddy.com, you have your escorts, you have glamorized pornography, you know. Now, it's not to discredit, there are women and men that their work is sex work and that's voluntary and that's their line of work, you
yeah.
know. You also have adults in the adult industry where they enjoy doing porn, but there are people that are being trafficked and against their will have to perform sexual acts in front of a camera, and that's against their will.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
that's
it's
one thing I was
all
going to ask you. Uh,
glamorized here.
hmm?
It's all glamorized.
Yeah, I agree with you. I was going to ask you about the porn industry as well because they're the opposite side of rich and powerful, but they
Mhm.
also have the exposure of rich and powerful. They're distributed all over the internet. Even things like TikTok or Instagram or Twitter or whatever, they'll show things that are from those sites.
Mhm.
Um, you said they make the choice to do the job, but like, how do you really know if they're making the choice? Because we can put something on camera, but it's not always what the reality is. So is it probably the wrong thing to say that they all choose it, or how do you kind of distinguish between the two?
Distinguishing between the two is definitely hard, right?
Mhm.
But I'm not gonna sit here and say I'm a saint and I've never watched porn. I have watched porn, but there's a difference between ethical porn and there's a difference between porn that, it's just like, oh, we'll just pay this girl X amount of dollars and then,
Yeah,
she'll perform some sexual acts. You could tell on their faces. You could tell by their body language and their facial remarks if they feel uncomfortable or if, you know, or if they're genuinely enjoying it. But you could tell also if it's against their will or not is if they do decide to come to therapy. I have seen clients before that have been within that industry, or if they have been survivors of sex trafficking, and they oftentimes they will say, you know what, like this was against my will. I really didn't have a choice. It made good money. I had to pay my, put food on the table,
yeah,
or even stripping, you know so it really depends. um a lot of people say like porn is not ethical, like what makes porn ethical, and it's like, well, um ethical porn, it's just like, um they voluntarily just want to do it.
yeah.
It's not something against their will.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Just to know that
Mhm,
there are people that, choose that for whatever reason, but I think, the personal choice is part of, life in general. So,
mhm,
I guess we have to just be aware.
mhm,
Um, one of the big things I wanted to ask you,
mhm,
especially with your involvement overseas in multiple countries,
mhm,
who can people that are being trafficked trust? Because,
mhm.
especially in a lot of places where there's a history of police corruption or, government corruption, like how do you, as a victim, let's say in Iraq, how do you actually get help if you really can't know who to trust?
Right. And that's definitely a difficult one. Uh, Definitely using your intuition. I mean, if you're a 5-year-old and you're being trafficked, it's definitely difficult to figure out who you can trust. Um, but I believe as you get older, thankfully, there are plenty of organizations that are fighting this battle against sex trafficking. We have the International Justice Mission, they're all over the world, and they're cracking down these whorehouses or these brothels and rescuing these victims and these survivors. So it
Yeah.
just really depends. I mean, if you're a 5-year-old and you're being trafficked against your will or you're begging the streets, it's really, really hard to distinguish. But if you find a 5 or 6-year-old begging in the streets in the United States, I would hope that they're not turning, a blind eye. There are many organizations here in the United States that are also combating um, sex trafficking or
Yeah.
abuse.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for maybe somebody listening in the States
Mhm,
that maybe is being a victim in some way,
mhm.
maybe doesn't trust that if they were to call the police or go to some place like that, that they would get arrested? Because I think that might be a common
Right.
threat from
Yeah.
the pimps.
So with that, I know that there are some organizations where they kind of provide little basic hygiene kits
Mhm.
for either strippers or prostitutes, and it provides like a 1-800 number where they could call and provide a like passcode or like a password,
Mhm.
and it'll let the organization know that okay, this person needs help or they need some rescuing. I've heard of that, but as I mean, I'm not a survivor, but as I would assume someone who is being trafficked or a survivor, there is a ton of fear, a ton of trauma. So it's pretty much just finding a way out, whether it's escaping or, using a payphone.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to distinguish because I've never been there, but there are so many organizations just in Miami alone. Um, Miami actually 96% of traffic survivors are in Miami. 96%. Florida, Texas, and California are the top three states
Oh,
where
wow.
there's the most trafficking activity.
Is
Uh,
that because they're close to the coast or the borders?
yes, and also because California, New York, and Texas have a lot of tourism.
Mm.
So, got a lot of that. But going back to that question, it's really just depends. Um, it's also it's also important that people on the other side, the people that are not being trafficked, are have their eyes open and have more of an awareness and
Yeah.
understand how to um, detect sex trafficking within their neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think that's important, and I hope that this conversation helps with that. I did have a few other questions if you still have some time.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that we talked about was the brothels overseas and, places where sex is a commodity.
Mhm.
Um, if these places are known by the church missions and organizations, how do they stay open? Like, is it legal overseas? Does the government participate in it, or do they maybe not know about it?
The government, for some places, the government is aware, and they do help, law enforcement, or like, for example, the International Justice Mission. They
Mhm.
work with the local governments overseas to track down sex trafficking, but sometimes communities that are very, very underpoverished or just very, very poor, it's just like very passive almost.
Okay.
Their law enforcement really doesn't do anything about it because it's just very, very poor that there's no money. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does.
So,
It's sad to hear that it's not, if they know where the place is, that they can't just go and shut it down. But I think in a lot of cases, if they were to shut it down, another one pops up next door. You know what I mean?
mhm. I
Um,
there
mhm.
is in the United States there's the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So this hotline allows people to report a tip. So if you believe that you see something unusual in the street, a lot of times sex trafficking victims will be begging for money on the side of the street with a
Yeah.
sign like, "Oh, I'm homeless," or, "I need money." Oftentimes, those are women that are trafficked and they may look homeless, but the pimps disguise them that way
Okay.
to get some money. This hotline also provides anti-trafficking services, training, general information, and other resources nationally. So this is in the United States, and the phone number is 1-888-373-7888. If the person is being trafficked, or if you're listening to this and you're being trafficked, you can call this number.
Yeah, that's such a good resource to have. I'm glad you put the number out there for people because I know a lot of times there's, if you Google a number to call, there's a ton of numbers and they don't really know, kind of where to start or which one's legit.
Mhm.
So I appreciate that.
I
Um,
do I
mhm.
do want to mention also too that there is this company. It's national as well in the United States. It's called the Polaris Project. It's a social justice movement that fights sex and labor trafficking in massive scales. So it provides um, myths about sex trafficking, facts, statistics within your area. So if you say, okay, well, I live in Tennessee, what are the statistics or what are the resources in Tennessee that are, fighting against sex trafficking? Or what are the statistics of the sex trafficking activity in Tennessee?
Okay, yeah, I've heard of that project before, but I didn't know kind of what they really did,
Mhm.
so I appreciate that.
Yeah,
And I'll put both of these in the description. That way, people can go to the
sure.
website and call the number if they need to.
Mhm.
Um, One thing that I really do wonder, and I don't know if there's any statistics, speaking of those, um, do we know what the chances or the odds are that somebody listening knows a trafficker or a trafficking victim? Like, do we have any numbers on that?
I do have numbers on sex trafficking in the United States,
Mhm.
but I wouldn't know as far as statistics, like if it's in close proximity.
Yeah.
But I do know that 1 in 6 people will become sexually abused before their 18th birthday in the United States.
Oh, that's a very high amount.
Yeah.
That's surprising.
Hmm. So 1 in 6 people will be sexually abused before their 18th birthday. So 1 in 6 is someone that likely we know was sexually abused before their 18th birthday, or we know somebody, a friend of a friend, where, their child is probably being abused.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these in general are underreported, so the numbers might even, be more than that, because I know a lot of
Yeah.
it just doesn't go talked about or reported at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I hopefully that kind of opens people's eyes to maybe at least be aware of the issue.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think we covered a lot of really
Yeah.
important things, and one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, from what I understand, you're working on becoming a licensed sex therapist.
Mm-hmm.
How does that play into helping people that are victims of sexual abuse or sex trafficking?
Sure. So a lot of people think, wow, sex therapy, like, what is that? You're going to teach me how to have sex. Sex is more than just penetrative sex. Sex is what you make it. So sex could be intimacy. It could be cuddling. It could be rekindling romantic relationships. It could be rekindling communication. So with the sex therapy certification, it's not per se a license. It's more of learning about different sexual dysfunctions. Oftentimes, sex trafficking victims or victims or survivors of sexual abuse have sexual dysfunctions, erectile dysfunction, uh, vaginal dryness, vaginismus. Their sexual organs have been misused and mistreated, that they don't function to their best of their ability because it's been traumatized. So there's always that correlation between the trauma and the brain, but there's always the correlation between trauma and the body. And one book I do recommend, it's called The Body Keeps the Score. When the body is being abused physically or sexually, even emotionally, the body stores that trauma. And how does it look? When the body is stored by trauma, it is stressed, it is under severe anxiety, it is fearful, it is in pain. So all of these components add up, where there is going to be some sort of sexual dysfunction. There is learning about reconnecting with your body. So embodied, like, sex therapy.
Yeah.
Knowing that while you are a soul and a spirit, you are also a body. So again, it's learning your body, relearning your body past the trauma.
Okay.
So it's not only just like learning about, penetrative sex. It's also learning about what a healthy sexual ethic looks like, and sexual education.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that's just communication, like with your partner. Like as long as you're communicating about whatever is or isn't okay, I think that plays a lot into, how you approach sex in general.
Yes, exactly. And I'm a therapist that's very open to that. I'm not a
Mhm.
sex therapist, but I do work with, again, clients that have sexual issues, sexuality issues, sexual concerns, um, again, sexual abuse. So it really all just ties down that at the end we were created as sexual beings, and we are to engage and express ourselves sexually. But because of abuse, that's been tarnished.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like a great point to end on. And I
Mhm.
just want to thank you again, because I know, owning your own practice and being as busy as you are, like I said, a Jane of all trades,
Mhm.
taking the time is not always easy. So I appreciate you
Mhm.
being able to and willing to talk and really open up some eyes. Like I said, this has been something that we've worked on, I would say a few episodes already, just the idea of what it is and kind of getting people more familiar with, trafficking and violence and the mental side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what you did today was just a, cherry on the top to really educate people where, like I said, these things aren't really talked about. And I don't feel like a lot of people really go out and actively seek them.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that it, reaches some people.
Yeah.
Are there any final thoughts that you want to share? Anything that you think would be beneficial to anybody listening?
Yes, absolutely. Um, if you have been listening, kudos to you. I know some of these topics are gut wrenching. It might even bring up past trauma. So please do listen at your own discretion and at your own risk. If you aren't ready to listen to this, it's totally fine. But I do want to challenge you to, wherever you're at, when you're ready, to Google just local statistics on childhood abuse, on domestic violence, on sex trafficking. And as you're doing your research, explore ways that you can be a source of light or a beacon of light to not only your community, but to your immediate circles, on educating your friends, your loved ones, your family members on incorporating a healthier sexual ethic, healthier sexual communication, or sexual conversations rather. We're almost afraid to talk about sex, but we were created sexually, you know.
Yeah,
Um, but to just really explore, you know, this podcast episode, to not just let it end here and be like, wow, those are great points, but to really encourage you to go the extra mile and make a difference in your community and within your circles.
I love that. Thank you again, Esther, for being open to it. And I'll put your social media links, down in the description. That way people can, follow you if they want. I feel like you send out a lot of good information, and the more information, the better for
Mm-hmm.
anything. So, again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Hey, just wanted to thank everybody for listening and hope you enjoyed the episode. We have a few more guests lined up coming up, so just stay tuned. Make sure you follow on Spotify, Apple. Give a rating if you want. Doesn't have to be 5, but don't make it a 1. And of course, if you want to check out my Instagram, where I usually post some things about my guests afterwards, and sometimes a little bit ahead of time, just to kind of give people hints what might be coming. That's going to be Instagram.com/Chris Garcia, the real one, not the fake one, the real one. So again, that's Chris Garcia, the real one, on Instagram. If you don't know how to look up the podcast with my links, or if you maybe haven't seen the links, you can go to any place where you get podcasts at. Spotify, Apple is probably the go-to. If you go there, you can just type in, "Is it just speculation?" If you still don't know how to find it, go to Google, type in, "Is it just speculation podcast?" If you want to be real specific, "Is it just speculation podcast, Chris Garcia?" So it's there. It's on the web, on the interweb, on the internet, whatever you want to call it. Just go and search it.